She was 19 years old, and by the time the frost came that year, she had buried the last person in the world who claimed her as kin. The man who cast her out was not a stranger but her own uncle, Silas Corwin, who inherited her late father's fishing accounts and decided, within a month of the funeral, that an orphan girl was a debt he had no interest in paying. He put her belongings in a single crate on the porch of the house that had been her home since birth and told her, without much unkindness but without much warmth either, that she was old enough now to make her own way in the world, and that the world, as he understood it, owed nothing to anyone. What she had left, when the door shut behind her, was $4 sewn into the hem of her mother's old traveling coat, a tin of her father's fishing hooks, and a small brass compass that did not point true north anymore but which he carried anyway because it had been in his hand the last time she saw him alive. She walked the coast road for 3 days until she came to the town of Millhaven Point, where the fog rolled in thick as wool and the fishermen spoke of a lighthouse out on Gull's Rest that had gone dark 11 years before, after the keeper vanished one autumn night and was never seen again. The town had condemned it, boarded the lamp room, and put it up for whatever anyone would pay. And what she paid, standing in the rain with her $4 held out in an open palm to a bald clerk at the county office, was every cent she had in the world for a crumbling tower that everyone else called a ruin and a curse. They said the lamp room had been sealed since the keeper disappeared, and that no one who valued their cents had gone up there since. What she found when she finally pried that door open would not just change the shape of her own life. It would return something to Millhaven Point that the town had been quietly grieving for over a decade, and it would answer a question that had haunted the harbor since before she was born. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Vance. If you have ever felt like the world handed you something broken and called it your inheritance, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Naomi Vance had grown up in a saltbox house on the harbor road in the fishing town of Course Bay, some 40 miles north of Millhaven Point. The only child of Ezra Vance, a line fisherman who worked the cold Atlantic waters with a patience that other men mistook for slowness, and Ruth Vance, who died of a fever when Naomi was 6 and left behind only a traveling coat, a handful of hymns she used to hum while kneading bread, and a daughter who remembered her mother's hands more clearly than her face. Ezra raised Naomi alone in the manner of a man who did not know how to raise a daughter but who loved her fiercely and practically, teaching her to mend nets before she could properly spell her own name, to read tide charts the way other children read primers, and to understand that the sea gave nothing away for free but rewarded those who paid close attention to it. He was not a wealthy man. He owned his boat outright, a modest sloop called the Ruth's Promise, and he fished the same waters his own father had fished, bringing in cod and mackerel and, in the good years, enough to keep a roof sound and a larder full. But he had a habit that other fishermen found peculiar and occasionally laughed about behind his back. He kept records, not just of his catches, but of the weather, the currents, the strange lights and driftwood patterns that told him things the almanacs could not. He kept a ledger, water-stained and dog-eared, in which he wrote small, careful observations in a hand that grew steadier with each passing year, and he taught Naomi to keep her own alongside his, insisting that a person who paid attention to small things would never be surprised by large ones. It is worth understanding, before the rest of this story unfolds, that this habit, this discipline of watching, recording, and trusting patterns that others dismiss as superstition or coincidence would prove to be the single most valuable inheritance Ezra Vance ever gave his daughter, though neither of them could have known it at the time. Naomi grew into a quiet, watchful young woman, more comfortable in the water than in the parlor, with callous hands and an unhurried way of speaking that made strangers underestimate her and made those who knew her well trust her completely. She had no interest in the courtships other girls her age pursued, no patience for the town gossip that swirled around Course Bay's narrow streets, and instead spent her evenings beside her father, listening to him talk about the lighthouses that dotted the coast, the keepers who tended them, and the strange fraternity of men who spent their lives watching for ships in the dark. Ezra had a particular fascination with one lighthouse in particular, a tower on a spit of rock called Gull's Rest, some 40 miles south near Millhaven Point, where an old keeper named Thomas Wren had tended the light for nearly 30 years before vanishing one October night in a storm that took no boats and left no wreckage, only an empty tower and a dark lamp room that no one could satisfactorily explain. Ezra had known Wren slightly, from provisioning runs he'd made down the coast in his younger years, and he spoke of the man with a kind of respect Naomi rarely heard him extend at anyone, calling him the most careful keeper on the whole eastern shore, a man who did not lose things, who did not make mistakes, and who certainly Ezra insisted, was not the sort of man to simply walk into the sea on a whim, whatever the official inquiry had concluded. This story stayed lodged in Naomi's memory the way certain childhood tales do, not because she understood its significance, but because her father told it with an unusual gravity, as though it were a puzzle he had never quite solved and could not stop turning over. She did not know, sitting by the fire as a girl of 12 or 13, that she would one day stand at the base of that very lighthouse with $4 in her hand and her father 11 years dead, or that the answer to his unsolved puzzle would be waiting for her in a room that had been sealed since the night Thomas Wren disappeared. The fall, when it came, was not sudden but accumulated, the way water wears through stone rather than breaking it in a single blow. Ezra Vance died when Naomi was 17, caught in a squall that took the Roos Promise and 2 other boats from Course Bay in a single terrible afternoon, and though Naomi's grief was immense, she was not, at first, without resources. Her father had left the house and the boat's insurance money to her outright, and for nearly 2 years she managed well enough, taking and mending work and selling preserved fish to the inland traders who came through twice a season, living modestly but honestly on what she had. It was her uncle Silas, her father's younger brother, who unraveled what little stability remained. Silas had always resented his older brother's steadiness, the quiet respect Ezra commanded in a town that had never much respected Silas himself, a man prone to card games he could not afford and schemes that promised more than they delivered. When Ezra died, Silas discovered that he had been named executor of a small trust meant for Naomi's eventual dowry or education, funds Ezra had set aside quietly over the years, and Silas, over the following 2 years, spent nearly all of it on a fishing venture that failed spectacularly, a partnership with a man from the mainland who disappeared with the remaining capital before the first season's catch was even sold. When Naomi turned 19 and came to ask, gently and without accusation, what had become of the money her father intended for her, Silas grew defensive, then angry, and finally cold, informing her that debts were debts and that he owed her nothing further, that she was old enough to fend for herself, and that he had his own family to think of. He gave her 3 days to remove her belongings from the house, which technically belonged to him now under the terms of Ezra's will, since Silas had co-signed the original mortgage during a lean year and used that leverage, quietly and legally, to claim the property. Naomi did not argue. She had learned from her father that arguing with a man who had already decided not to see you clearly was a waste of breath better spent elsewhere. She packed what she could into a single crate, some clothing, her father's ledger and fishing hooks, her mother's coat with its hidden hem of savings, and the small brass compass Ezra had carried on every voyage of his life, and she left Course Bay on foot, walking the coast road south because it was the only direction that did not require passing her uncle's house again. She had $4. She had 19 years. She told herself as the fog closed in around her on the second night, sleeping in the lee of a stone wall with her mother's coat pulled tight around her shoulders, absolutely nothing else to lose, which was its own strange kind of freedom, however cold it felt in the moment. She arrived in Millhaven Point on a gray afternoon in late October, footsore and hungry, and it was in the town's small county office, while inquiring about any work available on the docks, that she overheard 2 clerks discussing the disposition of an old property the town had finally decided to auction off after years of it sitting condemned and untended, the Lighthouse at Gull's Rest. Naomi's breath caught at the name, memory rushing back of her father's stories, of Thomas Wren and the mystery he had never let go of. She asked, as casually as she could manage, what had become of the place, and learned that the tower and its keeper's cottage were being offered for whatever anyone would pay, the town having long since given up hope of finding a buyer willing to take on a structure most locals considered haunted, or at the very least cursed, given the circumstances of Wren's disappearance and the 2 subsequent keepers who had each quit within a season, citing unexplained cold spots and a lamp room door that would not stay latched. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Otis Farrow, who clearly relished the telling of a good local legend, informed her that the lamp room itself had been sealed by county order since Wren's disappearance 11 years prior, on account of some dispute over the fixtures and the fear that the old lamp mechanism was unsafe, and that the seal had simply never been broken since, as no one who bought the place seemed inclined to bother. Naomi thought of her $4 sewn into her coat hem, thought of her father's voice describing Thomas Wren as a most careful keeper on the eastern shore, and felt something settle in her chest that she could only describe, later, as recognition, as though she had been walking toward this exact moment without knowing it since she was a girl of 12 listening to fireside stories. She offered her $4 on the spot. Otis Farrow laughed. not unkindly, and told her she could have a whole miserable pile of stones for that price and welcome to it. And the transaction was completed with less ceremony than she had expected. A signature in a ledger, a rustic key pressed into her palm, and directions to a spit of rock a mile beyond the harbor where the tower stood like a broken tooth against the gray sky. She walked out to Gold's Rest that same afternoon, unwilling to wait even a single night, and found the lighthouse exactly as described. Paint peeling from its once white walls, salt-stained and weather-scoured, with gulls nesting in the abandoned keeper's cottage and a door at the base of the tower that stuck badly but eventually yielded to her shoulder. The stairwell spiraled upward into shadow, and she climbed it slowly, her father's compass in her pocket for reasons she could not have explained, until she reached the lamp room door, exactly as Pharaoh had said, sealed with a heavy iron bar and a padlock gone orange with rust. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a fire poker she'd found in the cottage hearth, to break the corroded lock free, and when the door finally swung open with a groan that seemed to echo up through the empty tower, what waited inside was not the tangled ruin of old lamp machinery she had expected, but something far stranger. The room had been arranged, deliberately and with evident care, as though its last occupant had prepared it for someone to find rather than simply abandoning it in haste. The lamp room was small, circular, ringed with windows grown thick with salt grime, and dominated by the great brass lamp mechanism itself, its lenses dull but intact, standing silent in the center like a sleeping sentinel. But it was a desk pushed against the curved wall that drew Naomi's full attention, because upon it, beneath a film of dust and undisturbed by 11 years of storms, sat a stack of ledgers bound in oilcloth, remarkably preserved, alongside a locked wooden box and a folded letter with her own family name written across it in a careful, deliberate hand. For whoever finds this, and you Ezra Vance's daughter, if she should ever come. Naomi's hands trembled as she broke the letter's wax seal, and what she read by the gray light filtering through the salt-crusted windows rewrote everything she thought she understood about her father's old story. The letter was from Thomas Wren himself, dated the very week of his disappearance, and it explained, in the plain, careful prose of a man accustomed to keeping precise records, that he had not vanished by accident or madness, but had uncovered something he believed placed him in genuine danger, and had made arrangement to protect it before disappearing by his own choice, not the seas. Wren wrote that for years he had noticed irregularities in the shipping manifest of vessels passing Gold's Rest. Cargo logged as loss or damage that he suspected was instead being deliberately wrecked or diverted for insurance fraud, a scheme he believed was orchestrated by a prominent Millhaven Point merchant named Cornelius Ashgrove, whose shipping company insured an improbable number of vessels that met with mysterious misfortune along that stretch of coast. Wren had kept meticulous records of the lights he'd observed on stormy nights, false signals meant to lure ships onto the rocks, cargo he found washed ashore that never appeared on any recovery manifest, and testimony from 2 sailors who'd survived one such wrecking and confided in him before leaving the region for good. He had written to the maritime authorities in the regional capital, but feared, correctly as it turned out, that Ashgrove's influence and money reached further than an isolated lighthouse keeper's word could counter, and so he had made a decision. He would disappear, taking with him the appearance of madness or accident, and leave his evidence sealed in the one place he was certain no one connected to Ashgrove would think to search, protected by the town's own superstitions about the lamp room. Being cursed, he had hoped, he wrote, that someone honest would eventually find it, someone with no stake in Millhaven Point's comfortable silence on the matter, and he mentioned, almost as an aside near the letter's end, that he remembered fondly a young fisherman from Course Bay named Ezra Vance, who had once helped him repair a damaged skiff and refused any payment, a man of evident decency, and that if fate ever sent someone connected to that family his way, he trusted they would know what to do with her. Truth. Naomi sat in that cold lamp room until light failed entirely, reading and rereading the letter, understanding slowly that she had not simply purchased a ruin for $4, but had inherited, quite literally, the unfinished conscience of a man who had sacrificed his own life and reputation rather than let a fraud continue unpunished, and that the wooden box beside the ledgers, still locked, likely held the physical evidence he had been too careful to leave lying loose. News of Naomi's purchase spread through Millhaven Point within days, as such things do in small harbor towns, and what began as amused gossip about the orphan girl who bought the cursed lighthouse curdled quickly into something more pointed once it became known that she was spending her days at Gold's Rest rather than abandoning the place as everyone expected. Cornelius Ashgrove, it turned out, was very much alive and very much still the town's most prominent citizen, a man who had built genuine civic goodwill over the past decade through visible charity, funding the schoolhouse roof and the harbor chapel's bell, and who was, by most appearances, exactly the sort of respected merchant a town like Millhaven Point took pride in. When word reached him, through channels Naomi never fully traced, that the new owner of the Lighthouse had been seen carrying old ledgers down from the lamp room, his response was neither loud nor threatening in any way that could be easily named, which made it more unsettling rather than less. He called on her personally at the keeper's cottage, dressed impeccably, speaking with the warm concern of a man looking out for a vulnerable young newcomer, offering to buy the Lighthouse back from her at a price 10 times what she'd paid, framing it as an act of generosity toward an orphan who surely didn't understand what a burden the crumbling old tower would prove to be. Naomi, who had learned patience and observation from a father who never rushed conclusions, thanked him politely and told him she needed time to consider, giving nothing away, though she understood immediately what the offer truly represented. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted in smaller, harder-to-name ways. The general store suddenly found itself unable to extend her credit for provisions. A contractor she'd hired to help clear the cottage abruptly canceled without explanation, and Otis Farrow, the county clerk who'd sold her the property so cheerfully, grew visibly nervous whenever she came near the office, eventually admitting, in a hushed and frightened conversation on the harbor road, that Ashgrove held the mortgage on his own family's home and had made certain implications about what might happen to that arrangement should certain old matters be stirred up again. Naomi understood then that she was not simply fighting for a lighthouse, but standing largely alone against a man who had spent a decade quietly consolidating the very kind of leverage that made honest people afraid to speak, precisely the sort of leverage that had allowed him to profit from wrecked ships and vanished evidence for so long without consequence. She thought of her father's ledgers, of his insistence that small, careful attention eventually revealed large truths, and she made a decision that felt both terrifying and entirely natural. Rather than confronting Ashgrove alone or trying to reach the same distant regional authorities Wren had once distrusted, she would bring the evidence directly to the people of Millhaven Point itself, the fishing families and dock workers whose relatives, she now understood from Wren's records, had likely died in wrecks Ashgrove himself had orchestrated. She spent 3 days transcribing the most damning entries from Wren's ledgers into a clear, simple accounting anyone could follow, cross-referencing dates of supposed accidental wrecks with entries showing unusual insurance payouts to Ashgrove's company, and matching several of those dates precisely against local church records of fishermen lost at sea and weather that, according to Wren's careful weather observations from the same nights, had been calm enough for safe passage. The locked wooden box, which she finally pried open with a chisel borrowed from the cottage's old tool shed, contained physical proof more damning still. A set of altered shipping manifests Wren had somehow obtained showing cargo logged as destroyed that had in fact been quietly sold elsewhere, and, most powerfully, a signed statement from one of the surviving sailors Wren had mentioned in his letter, a man named Josiah Pratt who, remarkably, Naomi discovered was still alive and now working a modest farm 2 towns inland, having left the sea entirely after the wreck that killed his brother. She traveled to find him, and Josiah Pratt, older now and wearied by grief he had carried silently for over a decade, wept when she showed him Wren's letter and agreed, after much careful conversation, to return to Millhaven Point and speak the truth publicly at last, having long believed no one would ever ask and no one would ever believe him against a man as respected as Ashgrove. On a Sunday in early November, at the Harbor Chapel Ashgrove himself had helped fund, Naomi requested, and was granted, a few minutes to address the congregation on a matter of importance to every fishing family present, and she stood before that room of skeptical, weathered faces and told them, plainly and without embellishment, the story of Thomas Wren, of her own father's brief but telling encounter with him years before, and of what she had found sealed in the lamp room that the whole town had been too frightened or too superstitious to open for 11 years. She read from the ledgers. She presented the altered manifests. And then she called forward Josiah Pratt, who stood before his former neighbors and confirmed, in a broken but steady voice, that the wreck which took his brother had been no accident, that he had seen a false signal light from the shore that terrible night, and that he had been too afraid of Ashgrove's reach to speak of it until this very moment. The silence in that chapel, Naomi would later say, was unlike any silence she had ever known, heavier than the fog that rolled in off Gold's Rest, and into that silence Cornelius Ashgrove, who had been present in his usual front pew, rose without a word and walked out, and by the time the regional authorities arrived a week later, summoned this time by a unified petition signed by nearly every fishing family in Millhaven Point, rather than the lone voice of a forgotten lighthouse keeper. Ashgrove Shipping Company records corroborated everything the ledgers had claimed, and he was arrested attempting to book passage south under an assumed name, his carefully built decade of respectability collapsing as swiftly and completely as it had been constructed. The town of Millhaven Point did not become wealthy or transformed overnight, but something in it shifted permanently. The way a harbor shifts once a hidden reef has finally been charted and marked. The families who had lost sons and husbands to wrecks now understood and could grieve honestly rather than in the confused half-mourning of accidents that never quite made sense, and several received, in time, restitution from the seized remains of Ashgrove's estate. Modest sums but meaningful ones, delivered not as charity but as long overdue justice. Naomi Vance, who had arrived in Millhaven Point with $4 and a dead father's compass, found herself, in the months that followed, regarded not as a strange orphan girl who brought a cursed ruin, but as a young woman who had restored to an entire harbor town its own truth, and who had, in doing so, honored the quiet sacrifice of a lighthouse keeper who died, in every meaningful sense, defending people he would never meet. She relit the lamp herself, that winter, having learned the old mechanism's workings from a retired keeper who came out of respect once the story was known, and on the first night the beam swept once more across the dark water of Gull's Rest. Half the town gathered on the docks to watch it, understanding now what that light had always been protecting, and what it had cost to protect it. It is worth remembering, in the end, that Naomi Vance began this story as a girl with nothing, cast out by the one relative who should have sheltered her, carrying $4 and a broken compass and a habit of careful attention she scarcely knew was a most valuable possession. She did not buy a lighthouse expecting treasure. She bought it, if she was honest with herself, because it was the only thing in the world small enough and forgotten enough for a girl with $4 to claim as entirely her own, and because something in her father's old stories had never quite let go of her. What she found in that sealed lamp room was not gold or jewels, but something the town needed far more. The truth of what had happened to their own dead, and the closing of a wound that had been quietly poisoning Millhaven Point for 11 years without anyone having the courage or evidence to name it. She did not seek reward for what she uncovered, and when the town, in gratitude, offered to purchase the lighthouse back from her at a fair price so that it might be maintained properly by the harbor authority, she agreed, but only on the condition that she remain its keeper, the first woman to hold that post in the region's history, a fitting inheritance for a girl who had learned from her father that the world rewards those who pay close attention to small things, however unlikely, however overlooked, however sealed away in a room everyone else was too afraid to open. Thank you for spending this time with Naomi's story, and with all of us who gather here to remember the ones history so often overlooks. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that value is not always where the world tells us to look for it, and that the things others discard as worthless sometimes hold within them exactly what a community needs to heal. We would love to hear from you in the comments below. What is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something others had written off as broken, forgotten, or beyond saving? We read every story you share with us, and we are always moved by how many of you carry your own quiet Naomis within your history. Until next time, stay close.